From the archives of the great library of Arathes, Golden City of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 21. The two de facto armies that had assembled on either side of Fraenk and his junior associate Nim stood at a standstill. To the south, a snarling assemblage of offended kobolds, commanded by the decrepit elder, Old Kevin. And to the north, blocking Frank's way back into the safety of the city, was a conglomerate of the human slum's notorious gangs, whose spokesman looked like he considered piracy not something that should be limited to boats. Somehow rallying every nosebreaker from the slums into putting aside their differences, in what could have been a real step forward toward peace in Rounderville, that is, if they hadn't all been carrying a full armament of mob-style weaponry and torches. This was about to get violent. Fraenk briefly and silently considered if the pendant had some kind of bad luck charm attached to it, along with its other unusual and mostly unhelpful other ability. It certainly hadn't brought him anything but trouble from the moment he found it. Perhaps he would be well rid of it. Sell it to Dandrucken for whatever he could get, assuming there even was a legitimate buyer for it. The shady trinket dealer would probably keep it for himself and use it to read brothel girls' minds, cheat at cards or get people to reveal where they hid their coins, selling the information to the local thieves' guild. Fraenk wondered if perhaps he could hire a boat and throw the cursed chain out into the heart of Lake Ewan. Knowing his foul fortune, however, it would be swallowed by a fish, which would in turn be caught and served to him at dinner the next day. Fraenk would lift his fork and find the pendant dangling from the tines. He was broken from his thoughts when the apparent spokesman for the human mob stepped forward and called out to the old kobold.
"Give up your claim on these humans. They belong to us."
The man with the arrow-point beard called.
"They offend us, disrespect our ways,"
Kevin the kobold called back in his craggy voice.
"What did they do exactly?"
The old kobold seemed to falter in his fervour.
"They ask many questions, and then throw coin at us,"
Old Kevin said back.
"That's it? They asked you questions and gave you money?"
Arrowpoint smiled and looked at the men around him.
"Well, give me the life of a kobold where someone tossing you some coin is a bad thing."
The mob laughed with Arrowpoint. He caught Frank's eye and gave him a quick wink. Frank's eyebrows shot up in surprise.
"No, it not like that. They are bad."
Kevin tried to keep the energy of his gang up, but they were already starting to lower weapons.
"They bring the bad elf. He do this."
Again the old kobold displayed his missing finger, shaking the hand at them accusingly.
"You'll grow it back."
Arrowpoint waved dismissively.
"And besides, they didn't bring the bad elf. These are the ones what killed him. This here's Lord Neversleep. You shouldn't be trying to hurt him. You should be thanking him."
A confused murmur ripped through the kobold ranks. The two kobolds holding Old Kevin dropped him roughly off their shoulders. There was a lot of angry chatter, and many among them turned to head back to Kobold Town.
"In fact, you should return his coin."
Arrowpoint went on.
"No, we keep the money. It's ours now."
Kevin shouted back defiantly and scrambled to catch up with the remainder of his retreating forces. Fraenk cleared his throat, and his mind went completely blank. I thank you for that," he began shakily. "If you don't intend to bludgeon or imprison us, we'd be well pleased to leave and bid you a pleasant evening."
"Nonsense, Lord Neversleep."
Arrowpoint smiled.
"You can't leave now. You are the hero of humans and our honored guest."
A loud cheer went up from the mob. Again, Frank's eyebrows went up so high, they nearly fell off the back of his head. "I'm what?" Fraenk had been to parties before. He had worn fancy regalia at soirees for the High Lord Elves and fallen down drunk in the gutter with lowlifes who should have been in prison. He had been to celebrations, reunions, weddings, funereal mourning, fairs, rituals, rites, and festivals. Fraenk had experienced many a gathering where the expressed purpose was to test the limits of intoxication. But nothing was quite like the reception he received from the people of Rounderville. His cup remained at capacity the entire night, and by that he barely had a chance to set it down after taking a drink before more was being added to it. Unbeknownst to him, Fraenk had become something of a folk hero out in the shanties. The baker, Macon, was much beloved for his breads and pastries, not to mention his generous spirit for those in need. News of his murder hit the community hard, but at the same time word of the avenging angel, Fraenk Neversleep, was spoken in reverence right alongside. He was the human who did the unthinkable, killed an elf in the name of justice for humans. Fraenk had never shaken so many hands, nor had been asked so many times to repeat the story of his glorious victory over Bass Greenbrier. The men demanding each moment described in gory detail, and for the bleary-eyed children who were awakened from their beds, received a much more storytale version of the elf's untimely demise. Either way, it drew an interested crowd every time. No one seemed to care that at the time Fraenk was in a blind rage, or that Greenbrier was completely incapacitated and had not even tried to defend himself. Fraenk was sure to omit certain details of the story, which were still part of his ongoing intrigue, like the black worms and the pendant. He knew it was well enough to keep that to himself. At some point in the proceedings, Nim, caught in the wake of Frank's popularity, was swept up, poured full, and then carried off by some very tough-looking women who would not be easily dissuaded by Nim's half-hearted protests. But for his own part, Fraenk was getting tired and too drunk to function. He still had that voice in the back of his mind that the hour was counting down for him to find this missing kobold. 3 of his preceptors' lives hung in the balance. He could not have it hanging on his conscience that he was off imbibing and being hailed as a hero, while letting his own men die by the hands of the sadistic Fernbrooks. He had to find that missing kobold somehow.
Lord Neversleep,
began the arrow-point bearded man who introduced himself later as Joeth the Shanty Lord, and had been Frank's ubiquitous host throughout the events. The man had never left his side and masterfully deflected anyone who became too cloying or obnoxious. Please, call me Fraenk.
That wouldn't do. Calling you such a familiar name like we're long friends.
Joeth smiled. There was something both charming and devious in that man's smile. Like being his ally meant a fierce kind of loyalty, but an enemy would receive a wrath that one would not soon forget. Then just Neversleep is fine, Fraenk said. Joeth nodded and went about the business of packing one of the long stem pipes that the humans of this quarter seemed to favour. He packed it full of a rich aromatic tobacco and used a splinter of wood lit by the low candle on their table to kindle the smoke. His friends also lounged in seating around the room, drinking or nimbly manipulating knives in a weaving dance between their scarred fingers. They were seated at Joeth's personal table in the watering hole he owned, one of several in the village. He was not only an entrepreneur, but the head of a local social club for the rough-and-tumble guardians of a particular territory. The term gang attracted the wrong attention from the overzealous partisans and busybody civil servants who enjoyed finding excuses to send baton brigades into their placid domain.
Time was an elf pet coming down here being disruptive, picking fights with the kobolds. And by the way, they're not so bad once you get to know them. They just get ornery every so often, so we gotta show them we're not about to tolerate it.
Sure, kobolds are just like us. Fraenk smirked, still feeling the throb in his shoulder where he'd been stabbed.
But time was. The elf pets that come down here to make trouble would get a quick dagger to the lung and be buried in the mud flat.
Joeth puffed quickly, getting the pipe stoked. He handed it to Fraenk, who tried to politely demur.
Come on, it'll clear your mind from all the drink.
Reluctantly, Fraenk took the pipe and drew in the rich smoke. He was no stranger to a pipe, but whatever burned in this one was like flaming acid in his lungs. Fraenk shot upright in his chair and coughed violently, smoke jetting from his nose and mouth.
Whoa, Dragonborn, you gotta puff easy on your first go,
Joeth said, chuckling. This was obviously the same initiation he'd done to countless others before. Strangely, though, the effect it had began to work with surprising speed. The alcoholic muzziness in his head began to stitch back together, double vision merging into one. "What is that?" Fraenk asked when his lungs had finished spasming.
I call it the Trumpet of Fire. It's a blend of tobacco and a mix of a few other plants and powders that are not local to these parts, so you don't want to use it too often, though, or you'll start coughing up blood.
Fraenk made a mental note to uncover the recipe nonetheless.
Neversleep. I'm pleased to be wrong about you.
Joeth nodded. Fraenk almost returned the underhanded compliment, but stopped. "In what way? We've never met," Fraenk said evenly.
Yeah, but I know you. You're the Neversleep. the only human arch-preceptor. You think we don't hear about that?
Aye, Fraenk conceded.
And how does a human become something only elves get to be, we wonder?
A tale for another time, a hint of warning in Frank's voice. Let's just say it wasn't easy, nor has it been easy ever since. If I only knew what trouble it would bring.
You rose up in Arathis.
Joeth beamed.
That is a greater feat than most humans can claim. Just ask Osrius of Tigrian. Oh no, you can't. Because he's lying beneath the mountain, filled with the shafts of elven arrows.
Fraenk had a sudden vision of the carved wall in Blackroot's garden, elven archers and dead humans.
But sometimes when fledgling birds fly, they forget where their nest is.
Joeth continued. He puffed out a ball of smoke that rose up towards the hazy ceiling. You think I've forgotten who I am? You don't think the elves remind me at every opportunity? Fraenk leaned forward, glaring at Joeth. A few of the men within earshot turned heads, attentive to the raised voice.
Easy, easy, Neversleep.
Joeth patted the air, as much to calm his men as Fraenk.
I'm only saying you don't want to remember, at least that was what we thought.
Until I killed the elf.
A hero arises.
Joeth clapped his hands.
You are one of us.
There was a weird, manic energy about Joeth that made him charming at first, but now, as Fraenk had spent time with him, was concerning. This man had plans within plans, swirling and moving like the gears of a clockwork.
You showed us something new, Neversleep.
Joeth continued. And what would that be? Fraenk had a sinking feeling about where this conversation was going.
That we could ask questions like, why aren't there more of us at the top? Why do so few elves decide what happens to so many humans? Why is there no justice when an elf kills a man, but if a man kills an elf?
No, Fraenk cut in. Whatever you're thinking, you need to stop.
Did you know what happened after you gave that elf to the dirt, Neversleep? Maybe not. I heard you were sent to prison.
Joeth rekindled the pipe as he spoke.
For us, the city became a very bad place for anyone who wasn't elf. Very bad. Those in charge came looking for retribution, to hurt us because they couldn't get to you. And they did. Any excuse. You're not working hard enough, human. Wham! You pick a fight, round-eared. Bam! Don't look at me wrong, hardback. Wham! 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 We suffered for you.
The words hit Fraenk hard. The true cost of his rash decision continued to ripple. But this was also a gambit, he knew. Joeth was playing towards something, and he needed Fraenk to feel indebted. Blackroot has always been a sanctuary to every kind, Fraenk replied. The lady herself would not allow that kind of foul treatment in her district.
Aye, true,
Joeth admitted.
Blackroot was better than most, but that's one district. The city itself is poison, Neversleep. And you are the antidote. You're a champion to many. You can inspire them.
Only martyrs inspire people, Fraenk retorted dryly. I'll stick with being an arch-preceptor. It's slightly less deadly.
We'll rally behind you. This is your chance to end the oppression of your brothers and sisters. I know you care about that.
Joeth said carefully. Is this some 11th district nonsense? Fraenk asked, already knowing it was not. For many years, the humans and other non-elves had tried to form their own district in Arathis, led by one of their own with the goal of representing their interests. It was an idealistic and foolhardy notion, to say the least. The elves would never allow a human to have equal power to them, so any district leader would be figurehead at best. The point was moot anyways, because humans could never agree on a single person to lead them. Joeth's speech was taking on a much more seditious tone. But if there was a conspiracy that affected Blackroot, Fraenk needed to hear him say it.
How would you like to lead the Blackroot district? Sit a council seat instead of trotting in cold kobold skid in the middle of the night. We outnumber them 5-1. They need us, not the other way round.
Fraenk Neversleep took a long moment before answering. You've been a good host, Joeth, so I'll say this politely. Fraenk began. Any warmth in his tone was gone. I want no part of this, and as a courtesy, I will forget all said hence. We'll just call it the hazard of too much drink. But you will speak no more of this ever, because if anyone up there catches wind of what you're suggesting, it's treason. They'll use every stick of wood in Rounderville to build a gallows big enough to hang you all at the same time. Do you want to be responsible for that? Then stop, live your life, and don't give the elves further cause to treat you foul.
Disappointing.
Joeth leaned back, blowing smoke from his nostrils.
But I should have expected as much. Still an elf pet.
You'll have to talk tougher than that to hurt my feelings, Fraenk said.
The suffering of humans means nothing to you.
Well, you'll have to take human suffering up with the divines. Fraenk slipped his bottle out and took a drink. I came here looking for a kobold. If I don't find him, 3 good men are going to die.
I'd say you found some kobolds,
Joeth replied.
They were not happy about that.
I need one in particular.
Tell me. Maybe I can help. I know a lot of kobolds,
Joeth said, leaning back in his chair and stretching his arms out wide.
Maybe we can help each other. You're looking for the runaway?
Fraenk perked up. Joeth had tilted his cards for just a peek. You'll have to be specific. There's a few kobolds who match that description, Fraenk countered.
The servant from Fernbrook, then. Everyone knows they're out trying to hunt him down. Looks like they've even got you on it.
Joeth puffed a smoke ring, then another.
You seem to like helping elves, Neversleep.
That's the one. Where is he? Fraenk asked.
Well, since you have no interest in our cause, let's talk about how the Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot might be useful to helping humans outside the walls make a better life for themselves.
Right, and just how could I do that? Fraenk replied, already not liking the answer.
The sewer tunnels from Mosswater, which lead into the old Breakflint warehouses, we need access.
Fraenk froze, doing his best to keep his face from reacting. Here it finally was, the true purpose behind Joeth's entire evening. It was all leading up to this. For years, the sewer tunnels beneath the district had been a smuggler's paradise. A highway of illegal goods and shady individuals gaining access to Blackroot and the city beyond. They were uniquely valuable not only because of their utility for moving anything in or out of Arathes, avoiding the guards and customs officers, but also because it was the only access point that allowed for transport at a large scale. There were other tunnels in, of course, but no other could accommodate a 2-yoke ox team pulling a fully laden cart. Any one person or gang in control of this would quickly control all the illicit goods moving into the city, making them tremendously powerful. Which is why one of Frank's first tasks when he became Arch-Preceptor was to have the tunnels closed and sealed. Fraenk briefly weighed giving immeasurable power to Joeth, whom he liked well enough but didn't trust, versus the lives of 3 of his preceptors. It suddenly occurred to Fraenk that he didn't even know which 3 were missing, and a deep shame washed over him. At that moment, Fraenk decided that it didn't matter. He would not be giving over anything to this man who was unwittingly gambling with their lives. Fraenk subtly thrust his hand into his pocket, a casual move that he hoped would not attract suspicion. He smiled as he let his finger slide through the chain of the pendant and slowly closed his fist around it. "I'd be happy to consider it," Fraenk said, looking interested. "I'd need to be sure you know the exact location of the kobold, though." Joeth looked up and met Frank's gaze.
Ah, smart man. I knew you were reasonable, and please know that you have my assurance.
Joeth began to speak, then his voice faded to somewhere far away. Fraenk felt his hand go icy cold. Then images suddenly flashed in his mind. A tall, decrepit stone tower crawling with vines, at the top a glowing light. The voice of Joeth whispered in his mind,
The light in the wizard's tower.
Fraenk gasped. It was working. Joeth seemed to notice Frank's change and made a face.
What's wrong with him?
Fraenk could hear the man ask himself. He realized he had to keep Joeth's thoughts on the location of the kobold. "All right, I believe you. But who's going to lead me down the path to our little friend?" Fraenk asked, his free hand picking at the rough surface of the table. The question worked better than Fraenk had expected. In his mind, Joeth recalled the exact visual journey. Fraenk could see him moving in snippets down a darkened path outside the city, through a splashing river. The stone path was wet from the spray. Then onto where the solitary tower stood. The cold in his hand had become painful.
I'll send Jessen with you. He knows the way.
Joeth replied. Fraenk could feel the other man's caution turning more hopeful. Jubilant almost, like his plan was working, and he would soon have what he wanted. Joeth nodded to his man of mention, who cracked his knuckles and tipped a friendly 2-finger salute. There was one last piece he needed to find the place, though, the point of origin. "Exiting from which gate?" Fraenk continued, trying to keep his tone level. The excruciating cold in his hand had become numbness, which was not a good sign. Fraenk pressed into Joeth's mind. But as an image of the gate began to coalesce, a resistance fought against it. Somehow Joeth was fighting back, trying to resist giving up this final valuable piece. But the chain felt powerful in his hand, an unfathomable undercurrent like he was swimming in Lake Ewan, whose depths were somewhere dark and far below. All he had to do was reach for it, and it would answer. Fraenk pushed his will and found the Defiance was but a thin membrane, one that he could slice open with what could only be described as a mind knife. Joeth's inner being, the constituents of his mind, burst, spilling forth like the abdomen of a butchered hog under the knife, loosing its guts onto the ground. And Fraenk found himself awash in the man's anger, then fear and panic. Joeth's eyes suddenly rolled up until only the whites were visible. He pitched backwards in his seat and began to convulse violently. Fraenk was slammed by a wave of sensation, light, noise, and feeling all hitting in an overwhelming wave. Fraenk tried to release the pendant, but his hand was completely numb. Then he too began to convulse. If he didn't let go of the pendant soon, both of their brains would destroy each other. Awash in pure sensation, Fraenk felt the world begin to close in around him. A feeling like falling came over him, and Fraenk distantly wondered if this was finally his end. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.